I was born just a week after the Second World War began in a small town in England. My father was the descendant of a family that had started a retail and wholesale grocery business in Wiltshire in the early 1820s. My great-great-grandfather, James Stratton, had founded that business. And by the time I was born, there were about 5 or 6 branches all over the west of England. My grandfather at the time was managing director of the company. War broke out. My father enlisted and spent most of the war in Burma. My mother volunteered with the Red Cross, and I was raised by my maternal grandmother, who used to go to the cinema as often as possible. She died when I was 9, but she left me a legacy of loving movies, starting from as young as I can remember. And I still have the most amazing memories of films that were totally unsuitable for a small child. The more unsuitable, probably the better, that I saw in those wonderful years during the war. Then the war ended, my father came home safely, thank goodness, and life resumed in another town, and suddenly my film going stopped. It was like being withdrawn from a drug. I was deeply unhappy at not being able to see 4 or 5 films every week, which is what had been happening before that. Whenever I possibly could, I would inveigle my parents to take me to the cinema. They weren't particularly fond of the cinema, so it was a really difficult task. And I became a real nuisance, and of course, within a very short time, my younger brother came along, and I was packed off to boarding school at the age of 7, and there was no going to the movies there. But what I did start to do was read film reviews, because in the school library, this was a boys' boarding school, in the school library there were all the newspapers, all the English newspapers, and I would read all the reviews every week and sort of feel that I'd seen these films, even though I actually hadn't. So then my father decided that since I was going into the family business, I had no choice in that matter. I didn't really need to continue a regular education. It was much better if I studied commerce. So I was taken out of school at the age of 16 and put into a commercial course where I was taught bookkeeping, double entry bookkeeping, and shorthand typing. I can actually do Pitman's shorthand. I was the only boy in this course. Having come from an all-boys boarding school, that was something of a challenge. And then, when I was 17, I was sent to Birmingham, which was in the Midlands, in England, as I'm sure you know, to work in the retail trade as a preparation for coming back to work for my father. And it was in Birmingham that I really ran amok. I went to the cinema every night and 3 times on Sundays. I saw every single film that was playing, and it was in Birmingham that I discovered foreign language films and film societies, because one day when I'd seen every single thing that was on at the cinema, I went along to the Bourneville Film Society, which was part of the social club run by Cadbury's, the chocolate people, in the suburb of Bourneville. You didn't have to be employed by Cadbury's to attend their social functions, it seemed, as long as you paid money. So Cadbury's had this film society, and the first film I saw there was a wonderful film noir from the 1940s called Double Indemnity, and the second film I saw there was a Swedish film by Ingmar Bergman called Smiles of a Summer Night. And that opened my eyes to another area of cinema that I hadn't discovered before, something beyond Hollywood films or British films, but the wonderfully wide world of international cinema. I spent 2 years in Birmingham, a year in London, and then came back home, where I immediately started a film society in my hometown. I was 19. I programmed the film society, I wrote the program notes, and I operated the 16mm projectors. And we got about 100 people, which was amazing, mainly because my father sort of coerced his reluctant friends into coming along and sitting through 3-hour Japanese epics and things like that. But nevertheless, that was something I was very proud of. I somehow came to the attention of the Federation of Film Societies in England, and I was invited to become a member of the Western Regional Board of the Federation. I was 20 when that happened. And then I decided to go to Australia. The reason I did that was because my father was pushing me to manage one of the branches of the company, and I had never really travelled. I'd never been even to Paris. And my other great desire was to see the world. So I persuaded him that the Australian government had this amazing system where you only had to pay £10, and provided you stayed for 2 years in Australia, that was it. And of course you had to pay your own way home. So I thought, this is wonderful, £10, 2 years in Australia, that's no sweat, and then I'll come home through America or Asia or whatever. So I arrived in Australia in the winter of 1963, and naturally the first thing I did, I got a job as a storeman and packer in a warehouse in Botany, and that was the last time in my life that I went and applied for a job. While I was storing and packing, I was also, of course, going to the cinema. And in 1964 I went to my first Sydney Film Festival, which, as you heard earlier, was at the University of Sydney. I was amazed to discover that films shown at the festival that I'd seen in London before I left England were being shown with scenes missing. And this was something I didn't understand. In the context of a film festival, it seemed to me that films should be shown in their integral versions. I'd met one or two people involved in the festival, and they suggested I wrote to the festival board about this, which I did. The board's response was to invite me to stand as a member of the board. I was elected to the Sydney Film Festival board at the end of 1964. During 1965, I spent most of my time putting together a motion requiring the festival to protest if festival films were censored, to publicise whatever was censored, and also to move for a better deal for regular cinema audiences. Because going to the cinema as a ordinary cinema goer at that time, it was quite clear that almost every film was being cut in some form or another, and some films that I loved were banned in Australia at the time. It was really an extraordinary time. I think it's hard to realise that you'd go and see an innocuous Western and there would be, that would be cut, and a line of dialogue here would be cut. The festival passed this motion of mine about censorship, whereupon the festival director resigned, saying that it could never be implemented and it would only cause a lot of trouble. And so the festival board asked me formally if I would take his place and implement this thing that I'd so rashly proposed. And so I didn't go back to England, to the great disappointment of my father, but I stayed and I directed the Sydney Film Festival for the next 18 years. 5 years of that was spent fighting the government over censorship, but that battle was won in 1971, finally, under a coalition government, where we finally got complete freedom for the festival. The festival today does not have that. Things have gone backwards since then, but then we had complete freedom and to show anything within the confines of the film festival. And also, at our initiative, I guess you would say, an R classification was introduced at the end of 1971 to allow adult films to be shown without cuts, just in time really for films like A Clockwork Orange, which would certainly have been banned under the previous arrangements. The other thing I did, and you may criticise me for this, I felt that the Sydney Film Festival was in fact the Sydney University Film Festival at that time. And I felt strongly that it should be the Sydney Film Festival. And so after my first year, we moved the festival mainly out of the university to Rose Bay, to the Winter Garden Theatre, the late and, for me, not very lamented Winter Garden Theatre. And we were there through till 1973. Not very lamented because the guy who managed the theatre was also the projectionist, and he was practically blind and nothing was ever shown in focus. And then we managed to persuade Greater Union to let us use the State Theatre, and we moved there in 1974, and the festival, as you know, is still based at the State Theatre. Of course, I got to travel. Nobody prior to me in the 12 years before I took over directing the Sydney Film Festival, no festival representative had been overseas to select films. The films had been selected by reading magazines and deciding that sounds interesting or something. I managed to persuade the festival board to give me a budget to travel overseas, and during those 18 years I spent about 5 months a year traveling. So I was certainly able to fulfill that particular ambition, but also as sort of ambassador for the festival, and I think for Sydney too, during a period when cinema was probably at its richest, I think, in the late 60s and right through the 70s, when there were wonderful films and filmmakers in France, in Italy, in Eastern Europe, and so many other parts of the world, which we could bring and screen at the Sydney Film Festival. Then in 1980, the Fraser government started SBS. And when SBS Television was starting, the first CEO, Bruce Gingell, got in touch with me and asked me if I would be the feature film consultant for this new network, because they needed to show foreign language films from all over the world. I got the approval of the festival board to do this, and so I started doing that. And then Bruce asked me if I would introduce one film a week, starting in February of 1981, which I did. And that's the first time that I'd been on television without being interviewed, talking to the audience through the camera. It was terrible, awful. I watched one of those early things the other day, and it was excruciating. But it was great because I got to screen, select and program some wonderful films on SBS during that period. And the next year I was invited to add an additional program of classics so that we could show older films. And so we had Movie of the Week and Cinema Classics. And for the next 25 years, something like that, I was able to do that, and that's one of the things I'm really proud about, that for a whole generation, I think people discovered the world's cinema, great cinema, uncensored, by the way, because I wouldn't show anything that had been censored on television, to a wide audience. And I still keep meeting people who said, oh, they discovered Fellini, or they discovered Bergman, or they discovered Pasolini for the first time through the films that were shown on SBS. After 1983, or in 1983, I decided that 18 years was enough of doing the Sydney Film Festival, and so I resigned. And the moment I did, I got a call from this celebrated American newspaper, Variety, a trade paper, but famous for its reviews. And they said to me, we see you've resigned from the Sydney Film Festival, would you like to be a reviewer for Variety and cover film festivals for Variety? Their main reviewer in Europe had just died recently. And I said, well, look, I've never reviewed a film in my life. I've written films for the catalogue of the Sydney Film Festival. They said, oh, that's all right, you'll be fine. So for 20 years, I reviewed films for Variety. I was also asked to write for The Australian, which I started doing in 1988. Do you get the pattern here? I mean, I'm being asked to do all these things, which is wonderful. But and of course then comes the Centre for Continuing Education. This guy rings me and says, "How would you like to teach a course in film history?" And I said, you must be joking. I never went to university. How could I possibly teach at a university? He said, it's easy, as long as you don't let the students know they know more than you know. It's easy. And I said, well, okay, I'll try. I remember I took my son along to the first time I did it because I was so nervous, and somehow we got through it. And now it's the thing that I enjoy more than anything. I teach this course on the history of film. It's a very strange course, but I thoroughly enjoy it. I've got a wonderful class, and it enables me to delve back into cinema history all the time. We've just reached the middle of the 1940s now, and it's a course that is supposed to last 10 years, but at the moment we're going, it's probably going to last 15 years. It's sort of eccentric, but it's good. Then, of course, we have At the Movies, or the movie show as it began. So that came about because in about 5 years after I started at SBS, this very strange woman called Margaret Pomeranz was assigned to produce my on-air hostings of these movies that I was introducing. And I couldn't stand her. She was bossy, and she was just ooh. So we had a very fractious relationship when she came on the scene. But then we sort of got to know each other a little bit, and I'm very bad when I meet people for the first time, I have to say. We got on better, and we started having the occasional lunch together, and I discovered that she enjoyed movies too. And we got talking about the fact that there was no program on Australian television at the time that was devoted to reviewing films. In America, very famously, there was a program actually called At the Movies with Roger Ebert, who was a friend of mine, and Gene Siskel, which was extremely popular. And in England, there was a guy called Barry Norman who did a program for many years. And we thought it'd be nice to have a program like that in Australia. So we pitched it to the people at SBS, and they accepted it. I think they gave a very small budget to start this off. And somehow the moment, from the very first week, I think, it sort of took off. I still don't understand why, but it did. And so we suddenly found ourselves with a modest success. And by the end of, I guess we're talking about 2004 now, we were one of the better rating programs on SBS at the time. Then things changed at SBS. There was a new CEO who didn't like movies very much, or so it seemed, who wanted to cancel the Movie of the Week Cinema Classics slots. He got up Margaret's nose too for different reasons. So we were thinking of just giving it all up. And then we got a call from the ABC. It's a small world, this world of television. And the ABC person said, "We hear you're not very happy. How would you like to come over to the ABC?" So we said, "Sure." So we did. And we couldn't keep the name of the movie show because SBS had the rights to that. So we shamelessly stole the name from Siskel and Ebert, At the Movies. And so there we are. And we've now been doing it for, I think we're nearing the end of our 27th year. I'm not quite sure how much longer we're going to keep going. But we'll keep going, for another year or so anyway. We basically enjoy what we do, and the audience response is extremely gratifying. Just a couple of things I should add in this sort of rambling life story. A lot of people say, well, what sort of things really were being censored from films back in the 60s? I'll give you an example. In my first festival that I directed, we showed a Danish film. it was called Two, actually. And there was a scene in the film where these guys who were factory workers were coming out of the factory on a Friday night. And one says to the other, in Danish, of course, with subtitles, "What's up tonight? Going to dip the wick?" Now, I'd never heard that expression before, and it certainly didn't mean anything to me. So I was amazed when we got a very nice formal letter from the Film Censorship Board saying, this line has to be deleted. So in order to delete a subtitle, you've got to take that whole bit out of the film, obviously, and that's the way it worked. Going to dip the wick had to be cut for a film festival audience. That's sort of, and that's very typical. That's not a silly example. It's a very, very typical example. So that gives you some idea of the sort of pettiness of the whole thing and how ridiculous it was. The other thing I discovered, and again, I was, as you will have gathered, perhaps, I was raised in a conservative family. One of the last things I did before leaving England was attend a fundraiser for Harold Macmillan, who was the Tory Prime Minister at the time. Very nice man. And so, you know, I was not at all political or anything like that. And it was only later that I realized that if you were involved in something suspicious, some kind of cultural organisation, like a film festival that was showing films from dodgy parts of the world, you would come to the attention of ASIO. And to my amazement, in recent years, I accessed my ASIO file, which was extremely thick. And one of my greatest sins, it seems, and I think this is very important, you should all take note of this in the light of some of the political debate in recent weeks. One of my biggest sins was that I, from time to time, was seen wearing a red tie. So, I know that I've sort of sped through this career very quickly, and maybe there are some elements that some of you would like to ask that I can flesh out some things I've skimmed over. But I'd just like to conclude the formal part of this talk by saying, by reflecting really, that I owe everything to my grandmother. That lady who had no idea that in taking this small child to see these terribly unsuitable films, that she would be instilling in me what became a life, a career. So my life in movies I owe to my grandmother, who died when I was 9 and would have had absolutely no idea what she was doing. Loved her. Thank you.